I'd like to welcome you to a Ready Set Crypto and Check on Chain research report. This week we're going to be looking at a project called Decred, and it's something that I'm going to be calling a sound money DAO. Decred is a hyper-secure, adaptable, and self-amending, self-funding blockchain, and it achieves all of this by having an integrated formal governance system, and this truly does make Decred a relatively unique player in the market of cryptocurrencies. So what we're going to do is just look through some of the fundamentals of this coin, understand how the protocol actually works and what its strengths and differentiators are, and then we can look at some of the features which are coming down the pipeline, which truly make Decred stand out as one of these star contenders that's largely flying under the radar at this point in time. So the Decred nutshell. Essentially, it retains the sound money principles of a 21 million maximum supply and deterministic issuance schedule. It has a world-class developer team, so the original Decred devs actually built the second implementation of Bitcoin called BTCD, and that code itself was then forked into by the Lightning Labs team to create the LND codebase, or the base of the primary implementation of Bitcoin's Lightning Network. So that gives you a bit of a feel for the quality of code that these developers can produce. So the original developers remain on the project, and they're joined by other corporate contractors as well as individual developers who have joined the DAO and are all funded via the Treasury as voted by stakeholders. So Decred's real unique selling point is its hybrid proof-of-work, proof-of-stake consensus mechanism. And really, this is, in my opinion, one of the most elegant consensus mechanisms in all of crypto. It's a hyper-secure ledger, so it amplifies both the proof-of-work and the proof-of-stake, so it actually achieves orders of magnitude greater security than just a pure proof-of-work or pure proof-of-stake system for the same value of market cap. It also enables an adaptable governance system, so the protocol can evolve and self-amend and self-upgrade safely. And it's also implemented a network treasury which funds the evolution of the protocol over time. And this allows it to align the interests and make sure that Decred itself can continue to produce its own code, push itself forward, and essentially bootstrap itself without the need of any venture capitalists or other external vested interests. And this is a true differentiator. To have the entire stack of this really makes Decred a unique player in this space. So the real high level of what Decred is, it has this hybrid proof-of-work, proof-of-stake consensus mechanism, and that's really the bones of what makes Decred what it is. The sustainable treasury then again allows that aligned incentives, and it's that governance mechanism or the resilient DAO that sits behind it, the intelligence of the people and the hive mind that push Decred forward, can utilize that treasury via the consensus mechanism to enable the code and the development and the progress of the DAO into the future. The team of the project has always had sound values in security. Hypersecurity has always been the focus of the chain. And in terms of privacy, the team comes from an open source development, an open source operating system background. So their focus has always been on user privacy and user security. That's really baked into the ethos of the project. It's a very cypherpunk ethos project. And the fork resistance of the chain, so the hybrid proof-of-work, proof-of-stake system, makes it very, very difficult for a Decred cash event to occur. It's very hard for a chain split to occur in Decred and for one of those chains to survive. So Decred does an excellent job of remaining as a singular chain, which retains all of the network mindshare and infrastructure in one place, while simultaneously allowing the chain to evolve and change and meet the challenges both of today and tomorrow in that adaptable framework. And that's really what Decred is, and it's this very interesting and elegant design where each layer in the stack builds on top of the next one and makes it a very, very robust and resilient blockchain. And if we look at Decred in comparison to some of its peers, let's look at Bitcoin as the primary example, but compare it also to its main peers of, say, Litecoin, Zcash, and Monero. And if we look at things like the monetary policy, so Decred, and this is looking at the innovation, where is Decred differentiated? Where's it made itself substantially different in a certain way to the peers that are equivalent to it in this store of value monetary asset type crypto asset space? So it's got the hybrid proof-of-work, proof-of-stake, which is a 60-30-10 split towards proof-of-work, proof-of-stake, and the treasury. So it has many differentiating factors on the monetary policy in terms of how the value is actually issued and distributed to which parties. In terms of the governance layer, this is really where Decred shines and has a very, very different approach to things. So contrary to the rough consensus mechanism that all the other projects here are showing, where there's an informal node upgrade process. For Bitcoin, there's a soft fork only strategy. Some of these other projects have a difference in the social contract. So Monero, for example, is very good at actually upgrading. They've got their regular hard forks where they can implement new changes. Zcash has a more advanced governance mechanism, and Litecoin is somewhat smaller than Bitcoin, so it has more ability to upgrade. But ultimately, all of these are proof of work only networks. And in a proof of work system that is reliant on rough consensus, if there's ever a dispute, the end dispute in this system is generally via some kind of chain split, and then it relies on market pricing and the disruption that causes to the network. And the other issue is that there's a protocol funding thing. So Zcash has got an interesting developer funding reward, but that in itself is discussed and negotiated via the rough consensus model. And they've recently gone through a whole process of trying to get that protocol funding to work for the network and extend it for another 4 years. Whereas Decred has a network treasury that's been baked in since day one. The social contract and the mechanism by which the chain can actually upgrade makes it very, very different across all of these very important fronts that actually define how a blockchain functions and where its differentiation factors are. And then if we'd look at the last one on privacy implementation, so Bitcoin uses a coin join implementation, which we'll talk about later on. What Decred has done is it's implemented its own CoinJoin solution, but with its proof of stake system. So it's actually got over 125,000 DCR running through it per day. So it's solved much of the liquidity side to the CoinJoin problem, which is just not replicated in Bitcoin as yet. And in terms of the privacy side of things, Bitcoin has relatively poor privacy in terms of transactional layer, and it maintains an auditable chain. Decred is also an auditable chain, and it's worth noting that neither Bitcoin or Decred are ever going to be able to compare to the privacy solutions of something like Monero or Zcash. And you can start to see here that different projects hedge each other in different ways. And what's important about Decred is that it hedges other projects across multiple fronts in many layers, and that in itself makes it a very, very unique project in this space. If we look at the Decred issuance schedule, it has 60% that goes to proof of work, and that ensures that there's a distribution mechanism. The burning of electricity and the hardware requirements of proof of work, being an ASIC chain, means that those miners have to distribute many of the coins that they mine, and that ensures that stakers are always diluted. If the stakers had more than 50% of the network issuance, once you become a staker, you would always be a staker. By having the proof of work be the 60% and proof of stake only 30%, it means that stakers are always being diluted out of the system. And in order to maintain your stake over the network, you actually have to keep buying into the network, and you have to actually keep accumulating more and more coins. You can't just stake and forever be a staker. And this is really important because it's about diluting people out of the system all the way through to the 21 million supply cap. And that ensures that there's skin in the game and people consistently apply their hive mind intelligence to where Decred is going. And then that final 10% goes into the network treasury, which is essentially governed and managed by the Decred stakeholders. So it has a very, very interesting issuance schedule in the way that it solves the nothing at stake problem with proof of stake and the distribution problem, how you get the initial supply out. So Decred used a pre-mine where 4% went to the founders, 4% to the community. So that's a 50-50 balance straight off the bat. And then all of those groups will eventually be diluted out by the proof of work almost immediately. So there's a continuing dilution of all stakeholders over time, all the way through to the 21 million supply cap. Now, the hybrid proof of work, proof of stake security system it's a seriously elegant and very, very robust and now battle tested. Decred's been around for about 5 years now. So the miners build the original chain. So every block needs to be initially mined, which creates that unforgeable costliness, the immutability and the expense of proof of work, and the energy expenditure that is required to make sure that a chain cannot be unwound. After each block has been mined, the next block needs to be validated by the proof of stake system. So it gets mined initially, it then needs to be validated. It's almost like a two-factor authentication. And what this does is it amplifies the security. You not only need to capture the proof of work mining situation with the hardware and the electricity, you also need to capture the proof of stake system. So it's this double-edged sword. You can't just take over one mechanism. You have to actually take over both mechanisms to some magnitude. And the analogy of the proof of stake tickets, which is the system that Decred uses, is similar to a temporary digital ASIC. It's almost like a month long. It varies between 2 to 140 days. But it's about 28 days worth of having a temporary digital ASIC that is securing the chain until your ticket votes, and then you can either choose to resubmit it for another one, or you can then hold on to your coins or sell them or whatever the move is. So it's an interesting system where it's basically a two-factor authentication over the top of proof of work. And if we look at what this looks like as a chain layout, so let's say that block 4 is the chain tip. That's currently got the miners plugging away, reordering the transactions and getting ready to mine that block. Block 3 was previously mined and it's now being validated by proof of stake. It's being checked to make sure that all the consensus rules that are inside this block are as per the stakeholders' last consensus change, and make sure that they all line up and that there's no reorganizations or double spends. And blocks 2A and 1 have both been previously mined and then validated. So they are now appended to the chain, and they are now part of the chain history. In the instance where block 2B comes in and the stakeholders find that there's either a break to the consensus rules, they don't believe that there's a transaction, they believe there's a transaction that goes against the rules, or there's some system in place that makes it an invalid block, the stakeholder or the tickets will automatically reject that block. And the way that you get the amplification of security on the proof of work is that that block needs to be remined. So all of the work and the electricity that went into mining the original 2B is essentially discarded. And the attacker now needs to remine a whole new block, resubmit it for a vote. And if it gets rejected again, they have to keep redoing the work. So this is how you can ensure that not only do you get an amplification of the proof of work security, you also get this fork resistance where if a consensus rule change breaks and someone tries to fork the network and take Decred in a different direction, ultimately the proof of work system will be so expensive to maintain that alternate chain that it will ultimately just perish and be infeasible to carry on. So it both gets fork resistance at a network level, but it also enables this hyper security type system that's, it really amplifies that pure proof of work and pure proof of stake. So there's a very nifty explorer called at the Decred Explorer that looks at the majority attack cost calculator. And basically, to attack Decred, you have to make a trade-off. If you have maximized hash rate, if you get a lot of hash rate, you can mine the chain faster. So you can keep proposing these false blocks faster and faster and faster than the honest chain. You may not get all of them validated, but if you're mining faster, you can produce more blocks in the same period of time. Conversely, if you have more of the ticket share and more of the stake power, you can essentially validate the tickets, but you can validate more tickets, so you need less hash power. But that means that you're binding up and buying a large portion of the Decred supply in order to achieve that. And then there's some balance in between those two as to how much hash power and how much stake power that you need. And what's very interesting about this is when you compare the cost to attack Decred, which is in these different lines at various percentages of stake. So if you have anywhere from 5%, 15%, 75% of the total stake, and this is comparing it to Bitcoin's cost of attack on a daily basis. And this ignores the hardware capex. So we're not assuming that any of the ASICs are included in any of this. So there's obviously an additional security cost as to how much the hardware costs for both chains. And you can see that there's actually the Decred network competes directly, even though it's 1,600 times smaller than Bitcoin, it competes 1-for-1 with the total cost of Bitcoin on a day-to-day cost to attack basis. So it is important to note here that there's almost like in a 3D axis, if you apply the percentage staked, it's a banana shape. So at the 15% stake mark, that's essentially the lowest cost to attack Decred. And you can see that it's somewhere around the same range as Bitcoin was in 2014, 2015, maybe 2016. And you can see that in the uppermost bounds, when you're talking about either 5% of the stake, so you need a lot of hash power, or you have a lot of stake and therefore you don't need as much hash power, but you own a lot of the ticket pool, you can see that you start to get these very, very high values that are actually, in some cases, higher than Bitcoin's cost to attack on a daily basis. So this just gives you a bit of an idea of the magnitude of security that Decred can achieve, even though it's 1,600 times smaller than Bitcoin. Now, blockchain governance is really where Decred specializes, and this is something governance is always present in all chains, including Bitcoin. It's just generally very poorly understood. So the governance is the process where people debate, translate, implement, deploy, create code, and move the social consensus layer, the agreement that we have as a people, how you move that into code, and then how you implement that code into the machine consensus layer. So it's very much that process of humans going into code, debating over which version of the code is Bitcoin, which version is Decred, how you debate and discuss that, and then how you translate that code into a machine consensus layer, whether that be proof of work or hybrid proof of work, proof of stake in the case of Decred. So what Decred did with governance, rather than the rough consensus model, which is essentially where it's a Mexican standoff, you've got the miners, the users, the economic nodes, and the developers all arguing on Twitter and yelling at each other on GitHub, trying to work out what the code is, and the standard approach for rough consensus is no change unless there's global consensus. And what that means is it's generally a much longer, much slower, far more challenging, and there is a lot of risk involved in rolling out network upgrades, and they tend to take many, many years, not only for the debate and the discussion phase, but then to actually implement. So there's a long time layer to all of this. And it's worth noting that this is a feature and a bug. This is what gives Bitcoin its long-standing nature of not changing, which is a feature, but at the same time, it cannot upgrade certain features in a meaningful time frame. So there is a balance and a trade-off to both of these things. No particular way is necessarily the correct way, but there's more than one way to solve the problem. So what Decred did is it formalized this system, and it's used three essential pieces to this. So the first one is the Decred Constitution, and much like a national constitution, this sets out the guiding principles and the values of the Decred chain. What is it set out to do? What are its ultimate goals? And this is so that stakeholders, miners, and developers, they will be different today than they are tomorrow. These people can come in and they can still understand and know exactly what they're opting into. It's a very transparent approach, saying this is what Decred's values are, this is why it exists, and this is what the opt-in looks like, and this is how the system works. It's that guiding principle document. Politeia is then an off-chain proposal platform. This is where people can propose increases to development, marketing budgets, anything that's going to drive the project forward, research and things like that. And the tickets will then vote on this on-chain. So this is essentially how the Treasury is allocated. It uses this Politeia system on actually allocating the funds. And there's various quorums and things to make sure that stakeholders in general are in agreement with the direction of where things are going. And all of this information is anchored into the blockchain to ensure that it's censorship resistant. And the ultimate level of on-chain voting is for the consensus votes. So once a piece of code has been discussed on Politeia, once there's been all the discussion and comments, the developers have gone away and constructed whatever the code is. If it happens to require a change to the Decred consensus rules, and an example of this was the implementation of Lightning Network a couple of years back, then that code gets inserted into the node software in a dormant state. When 95% of miners and 75% of stakers have upgraded their nodes, so they have a copy of the new blockchain, but they're currently running the old blockchain, it will then go to an on-chain vote. And if there's a 75% approval rating on that on-chain vote, then the code will then switch on. So in order to actually roll out the code, the entire network is essentially updated, but with dormant code, and it then takes the explicit approval of the stakeholders to engage and switch on the actual consensus vote. So that's really the ultimate level, and it requires the highest level of quorum to pass a consensus vote in Decred. And what this really does is it makes stakeholders and DCR holders the centerpiece of power. So rather than there being this Mexican standoff between miners, users, and nodes, in Decred, all parties essentially have some role to play in the governance of the system. And all of this requires a time lock to your DCR. So if you want to participate in the staking system, you are bearing the illiquidity risk because your coins will be locked for some period between 2 and 142 days, averages 28 days. But because your coins are bound to the chain, you're most likely to make decisions that are in the best interest of the long run, right? So it's very expensive to make a bad decision because your coins are bound to the chain. If an attacker comes in, buys a whole lot of tickets, votes on a negative proposal or votes for a negative consensus change, and the price then craters, ultimately they're burning money. And this is part of the security system and why it's such an elegant and challenging network to attack, because all of the incentives are aligned to protect the chain in the long run. Now, stakeholders have a veto over miners in the scale of things. So in the case of miner centralization, stakeholders ultimately have the balance of power. But it's important to note that miners can also be stakers. There's no limit to who can be a staker. So not only are the miners and the developers the stakeholders, but contractors and users and exchanges and whoever happens to be involved in the Decred network can be part of that system. So it is a very all-inclusive system, and that balance of power exists across the whole network. And it really does come down to that control of the Treasury, control of the consensus rules, and using that controlled hard fork mechanism with dormant code to make sure that the system is always stable, always secure, and maintained by all the stakeholders who are involved. And the Decred Treasury is really the beating heart of the DAO. So 10% of the block reward comes into the Treasury. To date, that's been 1.06 million DCR. To date, it's spent about $8.7 million worth on building Decred, and as of right now, there's 640,000 thereof DCR still in the Treasury, and that equates to roughly about $8.7 to $9 million, depending on the current price. So what that means is in the 5 years since Decred has bootstrapped itself and all the technology that it's built since Genesis, it could essentially have enough runway, even if price never moved upwards again. It would have the ability to actually rebuild all of itself again. It's got another Decred in the Treasury. And this is a really, really interesting phenomena. And for every dollar change in the DCR price, if you've got 640,000 DCR in the Treasury, both up and down, but that's a change in the total Treasury output and how much it can actually fund into the future. So price is actually a key fundamental for Decred in that it actually can drive the Treasury higher. And the more momentum that the project gets, the more the value of the Treasury can actually extend the runway longer. And there's many great studies and research pieces that actually look at how much runway Decred could have depending on where its spending ratio and price and things are. So it's a really interesting and very reflexive asset in that the fundamentals actually increase for every dollar change in price. And the main reason that I think it's important to be looking at Decred right now is Decred 1.6, which is really probably the biggest upgrade in Decred's history, is just on the horizon. The community has lovingly named this thing Hidden Hydra because the hidden side is it captures the privacy element that's coming in, and the Hydra is that it's going to essentially give Decred multiple heads and make it an unstoppable DAO. And the key features that are coming out in this is there's Lightning Network scaling. So Lightning Network is an implementation that's only just coming out into the mainnet. It's been live for a while and being tested. It's now coming into the user interface of the main wallet to credit on. It retains this hyper-secure system that allows Decred to actually upgrade the network treasury. So the network treasury is soon to be decentralized and completely ceded over to stakeholders. DCRDEX, which is an atomic swap DEX, has recently been released. And an auditable privacy solution has just come into the fore, which uses the proof-of-stake system to build liquidity. So we'll talk through each of these features so you get a bit of a flavor of what's actually coming in this Hidden Hydra release. So Lightning Network is a scaling and an innovation layer. And really, it exists on Bitcoin, Litecoin, and Decred at the moment, with Bitcoin and Decred having by far the most advanced Lightning Network infrastructure. And this is really the preferred payment solution, and it provides near instantaneous transactions within that framework. And ultimately, Lightning Network is an innovation layer. So whilst it also provides the second layer payment channels and the instantaneous transactions, Lightning is the classic example of this. We overestimate what we can do in 2 years and we underestimate what we can do in 10 years. For Lightning Network, we are in the 2-year phase. We're starting to see where this is going, and some of the engineers that are looking at Lightning Network are really starting to see the future of building derivatives platform on it, starting to develop things like yield curves and channel pools and all sorts of interesting innovation technology that's really going to shape the way, and even building smart contract chains on top of Lightning Network. And Decred is the only other chain. Litecoin is fairly quick to implement Lightning Network because it's basically a single parameter change, whereas Decred has to build its own Lightning Network. So it's a non-trivial case to actually implement, but a huge advantage for Decred was that LND, the main Lightning Network implementation that we mentioned at the start, is actually forked from the original code that Decred came from by the same developers. So there's a familiarity and an ability to actually share that data, knowledge, and code between the two projects. So whilst Decred had to make specific adjustments and had to do a consensus change to actually implement its own version of Lightning, there remains a lot of opportunity for these two Lightning chains to actually start competing and also start complementing each other. And that, to me, is a really exciting space. And I think that Lightning Network has a very, very long and fruitful future ahead of it. I think a lot of people, well, the more we look at this and the further this goes, Lightning Network is a major development for both chains. Now, the CoinShuffle++, this is the privacy implementation that Decred is rolling out. So privacy is important for both individuals and for institutions. If you're an individual, you want to be, you want to have some kind of transactional privacy. And a big issue with Bitcoin at the moment and many auditable chains is that there's things like chain analysis and things that can essentially remove your right to privacy. And ultimately, in the long run, this can end up in a degree of, potential censorship. You may not be able to send your coins to certain places, to certain exchanges because of whatever the coin history is. And that could be no fault of your own. And likewise, institutions, they don't necessarily want their competition to be able to see what their total balance is. They want to be able to transact in a private manner. So both Bitcoin and Decred are auditable chains, and they're never going to be able to compete at the privacy level the same way as like Monero or Zcash, which are privacy focused. But what they can do is implement what's called a coin join system. And the way to think about a coin join system is if you've got a $50 note, a $20 note, and a $10 note, you can run all of those through the mixing service, and what will come out is a whole lot of $5 notes all split up. This is essentially what a coin join solution does, and it's very, very hard for any of the analysis software to say, okay, that $5 belonged to the 20, that one belonged to the 50. So it essentially breaks the history of what came before by splitting all of the denominations of the coins into the exact same amount. So that's how Decred's managed to solve this. It uses a coin join solution, but it's integrated it with its proof of stake system. So because there's coins going in to buy tickets all the time, there's a huge amount of coins. At this point, 125,000 DCR per day. It's almost 1% of the supply being mixed every day. And this means that you get a very, very large anonymity set, and the peers are also randomized. The people that you mix with is mixed through the protocol because of the random voting of tickets. So it's a very, very elegant solution that actually can't be replicated on any other project because it has this proof of stake hybrid system. And it's part of this very elegant stack where all parts of Decred actually complement each other all the way up and down the stack. DCRDEX. So DCRDEX is based on the atomic swap technology, which was also developed by the Decred team. And the very first atomic swap was actually a DCR to LTC, so Decred to Litecoin swap. The great thing about DCRDEX is it's trustless, it's feeless, it's a peer-to-peer, and it uses the atomic swap technology, which means there's no centralized custody, there's no fees on the exchange, and there's no token necessary to run the DEX. It's just software. Anyone can run a DEX market client, and any engineer can actually integrate their coin. If the coin or a protocol has atomic swaps, they can integrate their own coin. So it is this very much a free marketplace, and it's specifically designed in a way that stops high-frequency traders and a lot of the rigged games that occur on centralized exchanges. There's no way to fake volume on DCRDEX. So it is a truly innovative approach, and it enables a lot of innovation and interoperability between many chains that can then start swapping in and out of each other. And this is a really exciting, and it enables freedom in the long run. And I think the major upgrade that's coming that stakeholders in Decred are the most excited about is the decentralized Treasury. So to date, the Treasury has been a multi-sig that's been owned by the core development team. And ultimately, stakeholders will vote on proposals and on Politeia, and all of those votes will then be respected by that multi-sig. The developers have always initiated the transactions, and as contractors have issued invoices, they've always been paid as per the Politeia agreement. What this next consensus change does is it introduces a new opcode or a new transaction type called T-Spend. And this will move the entire Decred Treasury to a multi-sig that can only be spent with stakeholder approval. So once it goes through the on-chain consensus vote, and should it get approved, this essentially dissolves the multi-sig, moves the entire treasury over to stakeholder control, and turns Decred into a full-scale Layer 1 DAO, or a decentralized autonomous organization. And I believe that this will make Decred probably the first and maybe only fully decentralized DAO, particularly in the sound money camp of assets looking to be this store of value, future of currency, that has its own treasury that can essentially bootstrap itself. And there's been studies to look at what would have happened if Bitcoin had have implemented a treasury, and it's somewhere in the order of billions. If you can imagine 10% of all BTC going into a treasury that was then controlled by BTC holders, suddenly you start to see where the scale of this DAO can actually go, and the funding can even extend far beyond supporting Decred. I mean, if you look at the DCRDEX, DCRDEX is just software that any protocol can use. It's software for the entire ecosystem. And it scratches Decred's own itch of providing a censorship-free liquidity pool and market But ultimately, there's no way that anyone else would be able to write this code because there's a profit motive. And Decred has always been against going for that profit motive and instead writing code and building software that actually changes the world for a better place. And this is what's really exciting about the future of what the Decred DAO and being a part of it actually can be. And ultimately, when you wrap all of this together, what is Decred? Decred is rapidly becoming the Swiss Army knife of sound money. It's this hyper-secure system. It's a self-funded treasury. It's got DAO governance that allows it to be resilient and change and flexible. It's privacy preserving, and it's always focused on preserving that cypherpunk value of make Decred visible, but make the individual protected and private. It's adaptable, and it can do these controlled hard forks and change its software over time and evolve to the challenges of the market. It's scalable with Lightning Network and all of the innovation layers and the futures markets and the channel pools and things that are going to be built on top. And in the future, there's going to be things like shadow chains and various other smart contract platforms that get built on top of Lightning Network. And increasingly, it's interoperable with DCRDEX and various other implementations that can start allowing this exchange, this free exchange between assets. And of course, when you combine all this together, these are not the only arms that will exist. Where Decred goes from here is really up to stakeholder innovation and intelligence. But as with all things, there's going to be risks in all these markets, and particularly in cryptocurrencies, it's a very challenging space in that front. And in my view, Decred's most significant risk is just attention and liquidity. Despite being launched in 2016, it has largely flown under the radar. The team has often been very engineering focused about building the code, writing the software, building up the technology, and really Decred responds more to grassroots marketing efforts. It needs to grow through this grassroots type approach. And price and liquidity really hasn't quite reflected the relative code output. There's a number of great interviews with various analysts, Chris Beniski and Murad Mammadov, who've talked about the value of the code output versus the actual spend ratio. So the amount that comes out of the treasury versus the quality of the code that gets written is almost second to none for Decred. And ultimately, price and liquidity has not reflected this code output, which is, it's both a risk in that this, the downtrend can continue, but it's also the opportunity in case the market catches on. And that process by which the community starts to engage and actually capture people's attention as to what the actual opportunity is and where the Decred DAO is going and what it can actually do for the world. And ultimately, in all of these things, code and networks, and you combine that with markets and pricing, it all equals risk. There's many things with a lot of these, the cryptocurrency industry is absolutely full of all these things where there's technical challenges, you're combining distributed networks and pricing and all of those things and those attack vectors combined. Ultimately, there's going to be risk in all of these things, and Decred is no exception to that. So if you are interested and some of this has intrigued or made you think a little bit more about what Decred is, there's many resources that can take you further down the Decred rabbit hole. And honestly, the amount of research and documentation on the project is quite remarkable. So from the community education front, there's things like Decred Power, which is really an assortment of all the different categories of research and analysts and various calculators and tools that relate to the project. There's the With Decred and Why Decred portals, which are both community-led onboarding systems. There's the main Decred, Politeia, and DCRDEX sites, where you can start to look at the actual code and the implementations and scroll over some of the proposals, past and present. And in terms of data, on-chain, and research, the Decred Block Explorer is excellent. There's a huge number of charts that you can look at all sorts of metrics like the hash rate and the ticket price and how many people are mixing through the privacy system and various market rates, what the market depth is on DCRDEX. It's a really full-feature Block Explorer that's worth a look. There's a website, Decred On Chain or DCR On Chain, which has got a lot of on-chain metrics, similar to like a Glassnode. It's only just recently come onto the market, and it's slowly being built out and including more and more features and charts and research. There's a website called blockcommons.com, which was funded by by the Decred DAO, and one of the Decred contractors has written a great number of research papers on governance and treasuries, and not only for Decred, but for a great number of different projects. And there's a lot of comparisons and a lot of just educational research that you can pull out of it. So Block Commons is an excellent resource, which was actually funded by the DCR DAO. And you can always find me on Twitter if you are interested. I spend quite a lot of time looking at this project. I myself am a contributor for the project. looking at on-chain analysis. So DCR on-chain is in part some of the work that I've put together. And if you do have any questions, do feel free to grab me on Twitter and ask me. The community is also extremely willing to talk about it and just get people understanding what Decred is all about, because it's one of those projects it is under the radar. And, for better or worse, the more momentum and the more attention that it gets, the larger that the DAO can actually grow. And that is a really exciting thing. And Decred has always had this vision of changing the world for the better. And that to me is ultimately what keeps me sticking around. And there's two podcasts. So the Decred in Depth podcast is really a project funded system. It's really, really excellent in terms of actually understanding what Decred is all about. And if you want a single one-shot story as to what Decred's all about, I would recommend the podcast with Murad Mammadov, where he talks about the investment thesis, what the store of value narrative is for DCR, and why it is distinctly different to all other chains in the space, and how it actually competes and complements Bitcoin. And this is something that many projects, they tend just to compete, but Decred actually competes and complements. And it's a very, very interesting space in that regard. And then there's also the Rough Consensus podcast, which I'm a host of, or a co-host of, where we try to talk about everything from, on-chain technicals and fundamentals of all sorts of crypto assets and macro markets, and just kind of discuss what's going on in the world. So if you happen to be interested in that side of things, we do have a Decred focus in some of it, and a lot of our guests also are from the Decred community, and, various miners and infrastructure providers and other folks. So we talk about a lot of the economics of it all, and just try to understand a bit more about it. And that's it's an interesting little reference to look through in that sense. So with all that said, Decred is about to undergo a fairly full-featured and certainly a long-awaited major release in the software. It's going to introduce Lightning Network, a privacy mixer, DCRDEX, and the DAO Treasury, all to the consensus code and to the GUI wallet. So given how feature-rich and high quality the code output is, and this is both historical and understanding what is coming, it really is worth venturing into the Decred rabbit hole, because you might just be surprised what you find. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and thank you for listening. Cheers.